So first of all, thank you all for coming out tonight. This is such a fun topic, and I think it's fairly provocative and thought-provoking. So I wanted to have an evening around it because it's something that I think is really interesting. But before we begin, I just wanted to do some housekeeping items. Downstairs there's a bathroom. Since there's two behind us, there's actually two downstairs. So during the event, just feel free to walk downstairs, choose the restroom. And then after the event, we're probably going to be chatting for probably no longer than an hour. Just because I know people's attention spans don't really last that long. But we have an art activation that should be happening when we're finished. So when you are done listening, you can walk outside and make a stencil of some sort of art propaganda around cult membership. So that'll be cool. And I did forget the Kool-Aid, unfortunately. Apologies. But instead, I did bring two people who are very close to my heart, Terry and Will, who are the inspiration of this evening. I met Terry and Will at least 5 years ago, and I was in their living room, and I remember meeting them, and the first thing I found out about them was that they were ex-cult members. And I thought, whoa, this is fascinating. And interestingly, they were very normal people with maybe not. Maybe not. I guess like not exactly, but they weren't what I would have imagined necessarily cult members to be like. They seemed to fit in fairly well in the world that I was wandering into. And I just found them to be really fascinating people. And so the inspiration of this evening came from many salons that I've been able to attend with them that have opened my mind up to so many things, including how much mental hijacking is happening to us today in all aspects of our lives. So that got me thinking about the topic of this evening, this idea of cult membership, and this idea of counterculture, and this idea of culture, and this idea of influence and power, and all these structures that are even bigger than these little micro, communities, these macro scale trends that are really influencing our lives. So just to give a little bit of structure to the evening, what we're going to do is start out with a discussion around, what are cults to each of us on stage, and who are we on stage? So I'll just introduce myself first, and then I'll introduce Eamon and the rest of the group, and we'll just start from there, because this isn't meant to be a panel discussion. This is not meant to be a lecture. This is meant to be an intellectual salon, and by that, it's a conversation. So if at any time during this discussion you feel the need to speak up, I would love for you to raise your hand and bring a question to the table, because this is not just about us talking, it's also about you being a part of the discussion as well. And so the evening will be created. So my name is Dr. Molly Maloof. I'm a physician, and I feel in a lot of ways that I, in the last year, kind of have wandered into more than one cult on accident. And then you realize you're susceptible to cults, right? I found myself at this retreat recently, and I was listening to this woman speak, and I was talking to her about how I really wanted to create a group of people around some of my own philosophies, but I didn't want there to be a cult leader because I didn't want to build a cult. She goes, well, why wouldn't you want that? And this is actually a woman who deliberately built a cult called One Taste. So, she fully admits that this is a cult, and she admitted that night that that's what she had created. And it occurred to me that I had wandered into one, and I was like, whoa, what am I doing here? So that was interesting. And then I also found myself at a meditation retreat that was totally mind-altering. And by the end of the retreat, I realized, oh, this is definitely a cult. But I actually liked it. I wanted to be there, and I would have gone back. And I probably will, but I don't want it to be necessarily this thing that takes over my life. So that also got me to think about when is a cult a good thing? So we'll talk about that too. And yeah, that's a little bit about me, and I'll bring this to Eamon next.
Hello, hi, my name is Eamon Armstrong, and I am the creative director of a festival website, and I attend festivals professionally. And I'm here in part to talk about festivals and counterculture and community and belonging. And in the course of just getting to know each other, I realized that I was also in a cult. I was sent to a therapeutic boarding school when I was a teenager. I don't know if anyone knows what that is, but it's like you like go away and they make you better. Just a very, very restricted, behavior code where everyone like helps each other do the right thing, and you go through workshops and you're sort of ascending to some greater understanding. And I didn't really think of it as a cult until like probably an hour ago, so I will be learning a lot tonight too.
You're welcome. This is Will, so you have one. Here, let's pass this to Terry.
Okay. I'm having that one. My name's Will. I definitely was in a cult for about 18 years. Joined it when I was very young. It wasn't a cult, which I think is one of the interesting aspects of cults. You don't necessarily know you're joining one when you are joining one, particularly when you're that young. I have a lot to say about it, trying to kind of unpack it at that level. And like about 6 and a half years out, a lot of unpacking. And I'm pretty convinced that a lot of us are in cults, whether we explicitly know it or not. And, like any kind of cultural misfit, end up in San Francisco. And a lot of you folks have helped me unpack it. So that's my story.
Well, it's part of your story. I'm Terry, also a cult member, ex-cult member, now starting my own, just kidding. I was in for 15 years, but I'm going to backtrack it just a little bit. I'm just going to do a quick intro. Born in East Bay, Livermore. Rode horses for a lot. From a lower income family. Ended up, all our family converted to Mormonism, which was another cult. I tried it on for 8 years, didn't work. Left it at 18. In the meantime, I got a volleyball scholarship and was in Utah when I left the Mormon cult. And then was in Florida. Of course, when you leave the Mormon cult, you end up doing a lot of cocaine and having a lot of sex. So that happened. And then I was in Florida on a scholarship, doing whatever you do in Florida on a scholarship, which is also a lot of cocaine. And then, my scholarship ran out. My parents couldn't afford to pay for college, so I moved back in with them and got pregnant within 6 months, which of course you do as an ex-Mormon as well. And they were great. They said, hey, we'll support you. So I didn't get married, but I was on welfare at 21, just turning 22. Started a company not knowing I was just trying to make ends meet. It ended up being a multi-million-dollar company within 3 or 4 years. Oh, sorry. Oh, wow. It's just like anyway. So ran that company, it was fun, interesting until it wasn't anymore, and then went really philosophical, because nothing else, I'd never gone philosophical before that. I was just totally what's next? Ended up getting introduced to somebody who was a consultant for my company, and ended up on a retreat in India at 28, 29, questioning kind of foundational stuff about reality. I was kind of bored as an entrepreneur at that point, because once you become a CIO of a company, it's no longer interesting for some of us. And so went on this retreat, ended up coming back from that 2-week retreat saying, I'm done. And I stepped down as CEO, moved my son and I to the East Coast, not knowing I was joining a cult, of course. Helped create it, of course. And then left it 6 years ago, and have been really privileged to meet, I think, some of the most unique misfits, cultural misfits that have washed up on the shores of San Francisco. Really unpacking kind of more of a science dimension of human behavior, and I can attribute Bauman and being human Peter Bauman and Alison Bauman are here back there. They were pioneering a conversation around the science of human experience, and met Daniel early on, which was amazing, and Eric through Daniel early on, first being human. And I don't know where I'm going with any of this, except that I feel like it's like, you can see, like, this is a cult mind, like 10x. Like, there's been 10 cults at least, what I just described. And there was a meth addict for 3 years in between, somewhere in there. And I really think that we as humans don't really have any idea what's going on at this point. And yet the stories we're telling ourselves about what's going on are really compelling, each one of them. And you can buy into any of them. And I'm done. Sorry. That was a long intro. Great.
Hey, I'm Daniel. I don't know where to start, but I think my first cult was that of computer science and software, and then I got really interested in psychology and team dynamics. Insatiable novelty-seeking drive, got really interested in things like Burning Man, and followed I'd like to do cult tours. I like to orbit like Halley's Comet. I kind of zoom through and I visit it, and then I don't come back for about 100 years, and then then you see me again. I think I'm the most interested in this context about this word cult, that we lump a lot of stuff into this word, and consequently we have a lot of these conversations about, like, well, is this a cult? Is everything a cult? Is nothing a cult? Are cults good? Are they bad? And I think what we need to do is unpack what a cult is and what it means. And there really are structural differences between something like Scientology and something like Burning Man. There are structural differences between society and between some of the most pernicious guru relationships that run afoul. And so when we unpack this, we look at the variables of psychology, we look at language and how language traps people, we look at discourse systems that say, this is the only place to learn something. But on the other hand, we learn about truth that society doesn't tend to give you. And I've learned a lot from Eric in this regard, and he'll talk a lot more about that. But I guess I'm the most interested in unpacking what we mean when we talk about different groups of people, different language systems that don't play well with each other, and how we visit such experiences in really productive ways without getting trapped by some of the ideologies that those groups that we know are super pernicious, and these groups hold these like super weird values. But how do you also not just mothball yourself and sit in the cave of large society? How do you visit some of these things and understand what they're there to give you without getting trapped by them?
So, I'm Eric Weinstein, and just out of curiosity, how many of you are currently in a cult? Okay, you guys are the ones I'm least interested in, because I just think it's really interesting that everybody else thinks that they're not in one. I hunt cults, and that's what I enjoy doing, basically through trying to push out cognitive architecture that makes it very difficult for people to get trapped within cults unless they want to be trapped and seduced. And I'm really interested in a description of a cult that maybe doesn't sound like a cult initially. So it's some sort of we have genes that we're all comfortable with passing, and then Richard Dawkins came up with this concept of the meme, which is another kind of a passable. And this mimetic structure rides on top of the hardware, and fundamentally is either extractive, so that it's really parasitizing us, or it's contributive. So anything that's been around for thousands and thousands of years is probably in some ways contributive. And so the question is, like, why is it that we're so easily parasitized by cults? So one of my theories, and again, if this is understandable, it's only because I've probably honed it with these people, particularly Terry, Will, and Daniel, is that cults profit from the fact that the central cult, if you will, the consensus reality, as Terry always calls it, has to discard certain kinds of truth. And those pieces of truth that can't be fit into consensus reality are picked up by these smaller groups and tended. And they usually are involved in the come on to those cults. And so very often you're programmed to look at the late stage of a cult, but you're not programmed to look at the come on, where the come on is the cult's best understanding of the world. So Scientology, for example, might start you off by talking about the reactive mind, and you, hey, I never thought I can see that in myself. And then it's only much later that you get to Xenu and the volcanoes, right? And so, the first thing I want to do is to just point out that cults are often the places where discarded truth is housed and is used as the come-on in the sense of a pitcher plant, right? And so if you're really good, like Dan, you can probably drink from a pitcher plant and survive it. A lot of people use Landmark this way, which is really an interesting one, where it seems to do a lot of good before it starts to do something else. And the thing that I keep trying to do is I keep trying to give people control over their own mind up to a point. And what I'm most interested in the Bay Area is this is the last redoubt. This is Zion relative to the major cult, which is like the air we breathe, which we cannot even see. And the problem is that the people who've thrown off that cult are susceptible to everything else, because the sense-making apparatus that everyone else is using has been thrown off. And so the problem is the recapture of these potentially much more liberated souls and minds by these alternate structures, so that the human potential movement, if you want to call it under that big tent, is a combination of liberation and enslavement. And so that's what I've been most curious about, and been trying to do this deprogramming largely through a Twitter feed, and getting people to talk in a language which gives them more control over their own mind.
What is that Twitter feed?
I'm so glad you asked.
That wasn't a setup.
No. If you're curious, it's Eric R. Weinstein, and it's pretty chaotic. I probably shouldn't tweet as much as I do, or about random things that my wife is uninterested in. So sometimes it's just various educated brain farts, but there is a certain amount of cognitive architecture. So, for example, look for an essay on Russell conjugation, the taxonomy of the 4 types of fake news, the 4-quadrant model, and I try these things on podcasts and trying to get the alternative sort of media to propagate these things while the mainstream media really can't touch them.
So that was awesome.
And we're done.
Right? We're done. I think we finished up here. So this makes me think about a couple things. The first thing it makes me think about is my experience with Landmark, which is one of those cults that I got a lot of value from until I got kicked out of it. And I got kicked out of Landmark because I felt deeply, deeply triggered by the desire for them to push me into bringing people there, right? Like, there was something that went off in my head when I thought to myself, this is indoctrination. And if this is something that is needed by someone, they should come on their own volition. And then that makes me question this idea of, what is cult formation? Because Terry, you mentioned that you helped create this cult that you joined. So if those of us who are interested in building a cult wanted to build one, where do we begin? I mean, does it just begin with building following?
I mean, I would go kind of at what Eric was saying there in relationship to, it fleshes out the things that kind of domesticated culture is not fleshing out. The things that you kind of in that Gestalt sense are on the kind of on the verge, but you kind of have a kind of truthy sense that there's something to it. I know that's my experience. The kind of the consensus reality narrative of, get a good education, get a job, get a wife. It really wasn't doing it for me. So, that's an arranged marriage. That's completely different.
Within the cult, by
the way, yeah.
But I think that's where it starts, and I think this is the thing that's interesting to kind of unpack.
Yeah.
Is there is a lot there. We're increasingly culturally becoming suspicious of the kind of spoon-fed narrative, and I think that really opens up the doorway for cults. And again, I'm interested in unpacking it in the way that Daniel is. It's like it's not all. I would suspect that the majority of people in the room are here because they suspect it isn't all just black and white in that way, that cults are bad. Yeah. I'm curious to explore that.
I mean, I can speak to that. So let's talk a little bit about the difference in some ontology of cults. I don't. So one place where we could go wrong is if we center way too much on specific examples. So if we go way too deep into the truth about Landmark or Scientology or any of these things, we're gonna have an uninteresting conversation. So I'm gonna take a risk and sort of try to abstract some of it and talk about it in the abstract, and know that if we lose anyone, we have concrete examples to go back to. So there are these groups that, and again in Eric's. They possess a lot of rare knowledge, which is why a lot of people get good things out of them. But then they use a lot of really weird mechanisms, and some of them are overtly constructed so as to be brainwashing. And when I went to some of these things, I felt like, wow, I actually understand what brainwashing is now. I didn't before. And it's language that is expressly designed not to be interoperable with standard English language. And it is language that is designed to break your ability to fact check with the outside world. So for example, when Scientology says psychiatry is evil and there is no such thing as psychology and we are the only people who possess this knowledge, they do that not only in these overt declarations, but they do these in 1,000 little ways about redefining their own terms for everything that the psychological establishment has known for 100 years. Right, and so they're telling very real things about the world. Reactive mind being one of them. Some of them, in Landmark, it's about stories you tell about yourself. That you're actually living through the story, not through the fundamental data you're getting from reality. But the point being is they label these things with their own unique labels, and those labels get less and less interoperable with the outside world. And furthermore, they discourage you from tracking the outside world because that's how they retain capture of your mind.
I agree. I'd just like to kind of pitch in relationship to that, because I think when we think of these things, we often think of like this kind of Bond villain with a white cat who's kind of masterminding the whole thing, and having been kind of responsible for creating one somewhat, and kind of unpacking that, you realize it's really not that simple.
Well, yeah, and this is where I was going just to tie a bow on it. Is there are some that are actually created intentionally created to confuse, and they know what they're doing. And there's a lot of other ones that it's just when you get a bunch of people in a room and they're discussing something that they don't hear anywhere else, they're going to invent their own language, and their own language is going to solidify in such a way if they're not appropriately tethered to the rest of the world, and if they're not having to explain themselves to the outside world. In fact, there are benefits to them not explaining themselves to the outside world, because it lets them run farther, faster, and not be tethered to, well, is that really real? What do you think about it? And so sometimes these groups will go into isolation and invent all of their own language to discuss this thing. And then it'll just end up 20 years later that they have invented this closed discourse system that is tortured and weird.
2,000 years later.
Yeah.
Right.
So I can kind of speak to that, because there's this meditation school in Berkeley called Clair Vision, right? Great name. And they're like, we're not about clairvoyance, we're about seeing for yourself and knowing for yourself. And that made me think, interesting. So I go on their website, and it's so cultish, it's great. But they actually have their own vocabulary and language listed, publicly. Like, they're very open about it. And I thought that was really fascinating, because they're trying to go around this idea that they're secretive. They actually want to put it all out there. But then you find out later that there's all these other recordings and all these other books and all these things that you can learn from that kind of lure you into learning more and more about their way of seeing the world. And sometimes it's fun to try it on, and you might get value out of it, but I just thought that was fun. I think another...
Wait,
yeah?
I didn't answer the question yet about the cult, the creation.
Oh
of the
yeah,
cult.
please do.
I find it really interesting to reflect, because I genuinely think, humans are driven towards something that metabolizes in their system that has resonance at some level. And that's what happened, when I first got in touch with these teachings, whatever. And then you go in and you have all these really beautiful, bright, intellectual, in the case of our particular cult, very bright, very diverse, Western diverse, not diverse period, but Westernly diverse group of people from Europe and America. And literally, there's such transmission, when you stumble upon, going back to Eric's point, a kind of truth that's no longer being talked about. There's some sort of transmission of that engagement around that is so compelling and so interesting, you know, and it takes over your being, you know, and I left everything in behind, you know, not even thinking twice about it, quite honestly. I literally had not a thought about it. And I know most of us that were, you know, in this particular cult had similar experiences. And so there's something about that energy, that intention, that vibration of all in, you know, that you see in humans that is so rare. Even though we're all in, by the way, we're here. We haven't killed ourselves. We're still here. You know, so we're in life. But I think there's something about the energy and embrace of that, and then you fumble through, and then you find out the inconsistencies only over time, you know. But there's something about that I feel like is the, you know, we're all looking for some transmission of people that feel like they're alive, and it can be very compelling, you know, without questioning kind of the more first principle thought process that those people are adhering to, and in this case we just created our own thought process, and to your point, we created our own jargon. The whole thing made a lot of sense from the inside.
Can I build on that just for 1 second, which is the problem isn't the peak experience you encounter, right? You'll have access to these peak experiences, and you know, you can get in touch with this when people are like, oh, well, yoga is so culty. It's less so now because it's been you know, metabolized by the culture. But if you go back 10 years and someone's like, I'm not sure because yoga is really culty. There are these peak experiences you can have access to. The problem isn't actually the peak experience, it's the meaning that is made of that peak experience. So it's when you're in a deep meditative state and someone says, do you see that? That's Jesus. You know, like that's the problem, right? And it's not just Jesus. It could be that's, you know, whatever the making sense of reality includes making these inferences. And when someone has access to giving you a peak experience, they also have access to giving you a set of really weird meanings around that experience. And those meanings tend to be the things that trap people, not the peak experience itself. So don't be afraid of the experience, but be really cautious about people telling you what it means.
Can I take some questions? Yeah, and this is for probably everyone, but I've noticed that when you are like trying to help someone with a peak experience and you're deliberately trying not to put meaning on it, or you're like deliberately trying to not do the cult thing, everything just sort of goes like Brianish for a bit, if that makes sense. So I'm wondering if sometimes the like process of creating a cult is sort of a survival mechanism of, well, if I don't give you something, then like I can either have a cult or a lynch mob, and I think I'll go with the cult. And does that make any sense?
Yeah, I mean, it just absolutely it makes sense. And the brain is so compelled to make meaning. This means that is like one of the core drives of humanity, right? Like, what does it mean? I had this crazy experience. You know, and you're left in this profound sense of anxiety around not having the meaning you seek to put onto it. And so, yeah, given that there's 100 people in a room, we're giving them access to this peak experience. This idea of if I don't shape the narrative in a somewhat sane way, someone else will, or people will be so anxiety driven in that moment that they will lose it. And I don't think that we should shy away. I don't think we should be so zen as to say, what do you think it means? And be like a Rorschach about it, like it is whatever you think it means. Like things mean things, and so we should be comfortable telling people that. But there's a difference between something I call cognitive scaffolding, like an architecture of meaning that is designed to be torn down when you outlive it, versus something that is like the great and powerful Wizard of Oz, where when you pull the curtain back, it says, no, don't look behind the curtain, right? So at each step of explanation, you really need to equip people to unweave the lies you told them in trying to make sense of the world. And there's clear, bright lines between institutions that do this well and institutions that do the opposite and trap people in simple explanations.
Who does it well?
Well, I was going to... I think
I have a way of bringing Eamon in relationship to this, because because Eamon's over here, which is, I know he's taking notes, but he has an interesting perspective on this too, in that I think we live in a culture that's very I-driven, and I think deep in our kind of sapient firmware, we have this desire to belong to our tribe, and you know, I'm curious of your experience in relationship to that, because I know I'm sure you've reflected on that a lot too.
So I love the craving for community, and I love the idea that we all want to, we all want to be part of a group of people doing something amazing. And I think that part of the compelling thing about a cult is not just the peak experience or even just the community per se, but that you're like striving together to do something, and that there's a sort of sense of movement. And I see this in festivals that are very successful, that there's an idea of like a homecoming and a pilgrimage and a sort of like movement that you do with people that allows you to feel comforted and blossoming and involved, and you can kind of shut off a little bit and you can be amongst people and be trusting. And I think that in our modern mainstream culture, we don't have that experience. There's a constant sort of loneliness, and I think that these cults kind of, one of the things they prey on is this lonely, lost quality.
Yeah, I want to add to that. Anyone here has heard of Phil Zimbardo? Yeah? So I just found out about this guy when I was organizing for this evening, and he wrote a paper on how to stop mind control called On Resisting Social Influence, and suggests that mind control exists not in exotic gimmicks, but rather in the most mundane aspects of human existence. The inner pressure to be bonded to other people, the power of group norms to influence behavior, and the force of social rewards, such as smiles, praise, and a gentle touch. It makes me think a lot about, frankly, one of the reasons why I wanted to organize this evening is because I'm particularly interested in millennials and Gen Z, because it feels like the time we're living in is a really chaotic, crazy time where there just isn't a lot of meaning and purpose in the world for a lot of young people, and they're seeking it. So part of the concern I have about society today is how young people have been living in this digital world for so long, and that world is all about mind control, and that world is all about social approval. And technology is enabling people's minds, young people's minds, to be hijacked consistently. And so it's not that we're all super susceptible to these small micro cults, in as much as I think we're all super susceptible to this desire to belong and this desire to be, approved of. So that makes me want to sort of continue talking about the concept of cults, but even move into this idea of what is this concept of counterculture anymore? I mean, I don't even see it, because we live in this very crazy world in the Bay Area where everything seems to be mainstreamed, and it seems like the people that I'm friends with who are considered, like, they're burners, but they work for companies that are building these platforms for enabling political control. They're building these digital technology platforms that are enabling campaigns like Trump's to succeed. So where do they begin and where do we end? And we can continue talking about the conversation of cults, but a lot of this conversation tonight was around this idea of social control and mental hijacking. And I spent a lot of time with Terry and Will recently talking about this idea of mind viruses. And Eric, I know, can speak a lot to this idea of memes. So I'd love to learn a little bit more from you on your perspective of the Twitter experience of the Trump campaign, and how these people in power are using these mechanisms of cult membership to indoctrinate the masses.
So, yeah, okay.
Sorry, a lot.
Pass. No, just kidding. So I fell under the spell of a cult leader named Bertrand Russell, and he had this crazy idea, which was Russell conjugation. And the idea is that I am steadfast, Dan is stubborn, but Terry is a pig-headed fool. And the idea is that the cognitive layer and the emotional layer are divorced from each other. And so the idea is that if I tell you, what is your opinion about how the US should deal with whistleblowers? Well, we should support them. How do you feel about finks? Oh my God, I mean, there's nothing worse than a fink when national security is at stake. You're talking about the same person. And Frank Luntz, a Republican pollster I went to college with, dating myself, figured out that everyone is for the estate tax and against the death tax, even though they're the same thing. So the idea is that each of your minds is holding multiple opinions that are contradictory, but your emotional state will choose which one is operative. So the really interesting thing, for example, with the fake news is that The fake news meme that appeared immediately after the election is intended to tell you that fake news is only that which does not fact check. But obviously the most disturbing fake news in the uncanny valley of journalism is the news that fact checks perfectly, but chooses your emotional state while you're watching the factual layer. And by telling you what you should feel and weaponizing empathy and building the private toll road, the empathy superhighway next to the information superhighway, which everybody's focused on one and not the other. Why did the internet have such a small impact relative to what you might have imagined? It has to do with controlling your empathy and your feelings. So you will support a president, you will question a strongman, and you will call for the overthrow of a dictator. And if you look at something like newsdiffs.org, you can see the New York Times working in real time to figure out how it should present your world to you. With whom should you bond? Who is in the in-group, who is in the out-group? And so the point is that you've never noticed that the internal world has names for these things. Journalists will refer to the to be sure paragraph, which is where the truth is about 7 paragraphs in. And the idea is that you have to have a to be sure paragraph or you'll be called out as being biased. But by burying the lead, as they say, fundamentally, you can actually do everything you like through the truth. Now, why are these inside games not outside games? Why are these memes? I discovered the meme of Panamanian strongman Manuel Noriega way back in the day, and that was just such an odd phrase that everybody would repeat it. And the question is, why would everybody repeat Panamanian strongman Manuel Noriega? It just seems very strange. And no one even seemed to care or notice. And so this is why I asked how many of you were in a cult. Because I don't want you not to be seduced. Who wants to go through life never being seduced? You want to be seduced, but you do want to choose who seduces you. And in general, wouldn't you imagine that a cult would tell you how to go back into a family Thanksgiving and kick ass rather than never call your relatives again? Wouldn't you imagine that you would be able to go back into the mainstream and argue with facts? The primary thing is that a cult is going to sort of siphon you off and not give you a path back. So I do think that if you have a path back, and look, if you guys all told me that I was full of it, I think I could do battle with 100 of you and win. That's the kind of confidence that you're looking for from an actual level up. So the key tell is usually, when do I get to go back to my family? And if the only answer is when you're ready to get them back into the program, that's usually a pretty good tell that the meme is parasitizing the hardware rather than the hardware benefiting from the meme.
Wow.
Yeah. Adding a layer to that, which feels sort of sacrilegious in a weird way. There's a set of moves that you see people make, that you see gurus make, that you see institutions make that are trying to trap you. That's one move, which is telling you how to feel without telling you why, right? And that's endemic right now in the news paradigm, which is why it's so worth double hitting. As if you're actually going into physical cults, there's a whole series of other moves that are done. There's social proofing moves where there's the guru on high who is introducing, like, you guys all get it, right? And Eric doesn't, right? And they'll make that move, and to withstand that amount of social pressure is really hard to do. There's a whole bunch of other gaslighting moves that are made to make it seem like you don't have a point. So if you have some point that's against the orthodoxy, it's well, what does it say about you that you think that way, right? And all of these things are actually really useful tools. Like, what does it say about you that you are having this critique of us, or like why are you holding it with such energy? Like, what would it take for you to just not hold that with such energy? Okay, if any of you have had these, those of you laughing have probably been in cults because you've probably seen this. These are the stock and trade of people who are trying to deceive you. And the weirdness is, those questions are actually quite valuable. Holding up a mirror to you, if I'm your ally, is one of the most valuable things I can do for you. Saying, I get that you're angry at me, but why does it have that much energy to it? And if I'm actually on your team, I can do that with you. But if I'm just deflecting every criticism because there's a set of just rote moves that I can do to deflect it, then I'm not on your side. In fact, I'm trying to cut the phone lines to the building.
So Terry and Will, I'd really love to hear a bit about your experience, because I remember distinctly you telling me about how in this group you were constantly forced to question yourself in a way that was it really kind of cut to the core. And I just can't exactly remember how you described it, but it seemed to me I just remember feeling like it would make me very insecure to be put in that position consistently. So why don't you talk a little bit about how that experience was for you?
I think one way of getting at it is everybody in the room, just imagine like the worst fears you know about yourself being revealed with the people you're most intimate with 24/7 for 15 years. That's kind of the experience of being in a cult, or our particular cult. It's like let me say it a slightly different way. It's like, as far as I can tell, we as humans have a persona, an advertising persona that we're constantly projecting on each other to galvanize around the resources we want, around the ideas that we want people to adhere to, et cetera, et cetera. And you get in enough of an intimate space with people who have seen through a lot of your ulterior motives, for lack of a better word. I don't even think they're negative, but ulterior motives.
They have the antidote to your marketing department.
Yeah. And there's something about what we saw consistently within this cult, particularly, where there's a narcissistic rage that rises out of you once you feel like you've been pinned down at a level that you haven't been playing the game. Like you yourself didn't know you were constructing this personality that now everybody gets to call out. If this is making sense, I can't tell by any of your expressions. And so there's something about that moment consistently as a human that I feel like, quite honestly, I feel like the Trump thing has kind of opened the floodgates where we can actually get into some deeper discussion about who we really are as humans and what's really going on under the surface. Sorry, I went there. But I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just saying seems to be the case at this point. So, but I was also thinking, Daniel, in response to something you just said, I wanted to go at it in a slightly different way.
The ones that say about you that reflect your relation to your guru in that moment, or being pinned to that reflection? Yes,
there's something about at least my particular cult experience where the draw was that it was a pull, almost a fake promise that you were actually going to go somewhere that your guru couldn't, and he kind of promised that for all of us. And so there was this promise of being in a place that he himself couldn't access himself, and that we were trying to access together. And so it's not, so it wasn't subordination in that way. It was tricky. It was like both. We were like super empowered, and we were also super subordinate. And we were playing that game with each other over time that just got, we can tell stories. If you guys want to hear them, just find us afterwards. It's kind of crazy. Go ahead.
Well, this is something, again, in terms of this, like my understanding of this may be kind of not entirely true, but I think there's probably some truth to this, that if you kind of go back several generations, if somebody asked you your name, you just refer to your surname. So there's something incredibly powerful to be kind of depersonalized to a point where you're actually representative of your tribe versus you. And you feel incredibly strong and incredibly powerful in that place. If there's plenty of terrorist organizations, I'm sure, that have this experience. And it's the thing that I think that Eric was saying. You feel like I could take on all of this, the entire audience, from an idea space perspective, and and we're not really armed that way in contemporary society. So that there is something very powerful about this, being able to see yourself as not Will, to not personalize your experience, and I wonder how many cults tap into that kind of ancestral past.
I'll let Terry go.
Yeah, sorry, I just had one more thought around what Eric said, and the thing I think I've learned is that even the idea of what you just said in terms of a positive cult, or for lack of a better word, even that, it's like our mind hijacks the narrative so quickly that we will then pretend to be that person that can then go back to the family and have, constructive conversations. The layers of pretense that we put on ourselves as humans, and the layers of constructing around what we think is socially either rebellious or interesting or significant, it's like you cannot end the questioning, as far as I can tell, as humans.
Can I give an example of that? So going back to Eric's example.
By the way, I love the idea of it. I totally agree. We didn't do that.
So going back to Eric's example of Russell conjugation or emotional conjugation, the person who comes back to Thanksgiving and is being totally boorish to their family, like is just lambasting their family for not joining the cult, and there's so much more available. Like, notice that that's not their narrative. Like, their narrative isn't that, right? Their narrative is, I am just standing for what this family can be. I see so much more available for us. Why don't you see it with me, right? And so there are these like two sides of this coin, and it's really, really hard to live a life where you're constantly asking, in what way might my narratives about my motives for my actions, like in what ways might I be the boorish guy at Thanksgiving who believes that he's standing for what this family can be? And it's one thing when you construct it yourself, and it's another thing when you might have been programmed with this.
So, as I was doing this research on this concept of cult formation and how do the cults bring people in, Edgar Schein described the process of coercive persuasion as a 3-stage process, which I'd love to add some educational components to because you're going to need to know this when you're trying to get people to join your cult. So there's this unfreezing of the identity, breaking the person down. It's the first step. And then changing, the indoctrination process. And then refreezing, which is reinforcing this new identity, which sounds like this new identity, in a lot of ways in your cult, was this sort of intersubjective group identity. So just be aware of that. If you find yourself in an organization and people are deconstructing your identity, that might be a sign that you're potentially joining a cult.
So now I want to talk about my therapeutic boarding school. These are not prepared remarks. So we got sent away because we did drugs, and our parents were really concerned, and they couldn't figure out what to do with us, and everyone was really worried about us. So there's sort of like a righteousness with which we were unwillingly brought into this environment. And my experience was at a school called Cascade in Northern California, and we had 3 hours of, they called it group therapy. Well, they called it forums and sort of group therapy, but really it was like a sort of like group attacking of each other. And it made me think of this when you talked about breaking people down. But the idea was that someone did something wrong, like peed in someone's shampoo or something like that, like some sort of like thing, and it was a cry for help. So the way you would best serve them was to attack them until they broke down and admitted that they'd peed in your shampoo because of some horrible thing that had happened, and then they reveal the horrible thing that would happen, and everyone rewards them and says, "Gosh, you're just so good. You did such a good job." And I have never thought of this as a cult. I thought it was really sort of fucked up and strange, and I learned a lot, but I never thought of it as a cult. But this experience, when you're talking about deconstructing unfreezing the identity, breaking it down, giving you an alternative sort of identity, and then building it up again as a way of, I believe that the people who were running this school believed themselves to be in service of, quote, at-risk youth, and that they needed to kind of get to the core of the innocent lambs that we really were, and then build us back up so that we would stop smoking pot. And and I got stuck in it. I got the breakdown part, but I didn't get the build back up part. And at that time, I drank the Kool-Aid early on because I realized that would be what winning was in that environment. So I was like, I had like littles that I was teaching things to, and I was like telling everyone you can't sing pop songs because it's so bad and it'll ruin your therapy. I can speak more on what I'm talking about later. But I had a breakdown experience, and I never got the build up again. And I think I've always now I have that as part of my personal narrative is this sort of like, I didn't get the build, suddenly the scales fell from my eyes and I was like, oh gosh, there is no actual answer at the center of all of this crying.
Well, so just an uncomfortable aspect of this is that if you think about this as vehicle and payload, right? A lot of this breaking things down and building back up and reforming is all about vehicle. And the fact is that most of the vehicles deliver these really noxious payloads. But as somebody who discovered India not through a cult, but just on my own, you show up in a place and you realize you don't know how to eat because it's not just eat with your hands, it's eat with your hands a very particular way. It's not, you go to the bathroom, there's a hole, there's some sort of weird thing with two handles. Like, you're really back to square zero, and there's no cult leader saying, and now I'm going to build you up as an Indian. You just have to sort of figure it out. And if you've ever had these extremely strange experiences, you could do it through psychedelics, you may be able to do it through meditation, maybe you get lost in Mongolia and you don't know how to get yourself out. This process is just vehicle. The payload is the really scary part. And the fact that almost all payloads are freakish is a different question. Now, if you're going to go to war, you probably need to go to boot camp in order to be broken down as a child and then built back up as a soldier, or you're going to die on the battlefield. Now, of course, you're being programmed to fight for your country, but the fact of the matter is it's both good payload and bad payload. That's pretty easy to see. Right? If you're going to sing in a choir and you're just doing your own thing, it's not going to work. I was asked not to sing in lip read at my 6th grade choir because the cult didn't work. I think that what we have to stop doing is just inspecting the fact that there's a vehicle that has this feature, and I think we have to ask ourselves the question, what is the ultimate point? Is it that you're going to be in control, that you're going to know how the magic trick is done, that you're going to have a say in who is your seducer and seductress, what kinds of things they load in, that you can unload them if necessary. But in general, we require to have we want meaning in our lives. I don't want to deconstruct everything so that fundamentally you're not fooled by anything and you have no meaning and you just go through in this perfectly enlightened but completely meaningless state. So I'm just a little bit worried that the tells of this behavior also match exactly what you need, and that the real thing to do is to inspect the payload, because the vehicle is usually some variant of the same thing.
Yeah.
Kind of depersonalization and deconstruction has an inverse relationship, inverse correlation with meaning. I mean, there's kind of a classic phrase, as you get further along the artistic path, you feel more, you hurt more, but you suffer less. Like, I can say in my direct experience that an element of depersonalization, like I'm not chattering, I'm not visceral, emotional trigger, emotional story on top of it, but that it has nothing to do with the amount of meaning that I've gotten over time. Just the opposite. There's a beauty, like preciousness that kind of emerges from that area. And so it's tricky because one of the vehicles to, I mean, you can call it, you can call it Maslow's plateau experience, which you added later in life, and there was a change beyond experience. It's tricky, right? Because the deconstruction, one learns to rest with it quite good. The people who study this scientifically, the Center for the Study of Non-Dual Consciousness, found that in their research, most people experience even mildly depersonalized experiences. The difference between people who are awakened to the state of being and people who are in the psych ward is just the subjective experience, whether they can use it, and obviously they're depersonalization is not actually separating us from.
Yes. So let me speak to this. It's a great point you bring up. So the key, and sort of to use a framework similar to Eric's vehicle and payload, one has to really separate skills that you learn. Like, there are such things as skills, right? And people teach skills, right? And in putting yourself in a radically different environment, you can learn skills. So let's assume in order to get in tonight, everyone had to take their clothes off, right? So we're all in here naked, right? That change of the architecture of what we're doing here would do multiple things at the same time. And this is why it's so hard to talk about. It would teach a skill, and in fact, it would teach a skill of non-attachment, of being comfortable with yourself, right? It would also radically change what it meant to win in this environment. It would you'd all sorts of games like, I'm fine. I mean, there'd be all sorts of really interesting changes, okay? And so the point is that you have to think about what are the actual skills you're delivering to someone. And yes, an environment of depersonalization teaches you things about the way that the ego structure works and the way that you conceptualize self and other in a way that you won't get in typical Western society. And at the same time, alongside that, comes a totally different set of games and a totally different set of winning and a totally different structure. And you kind of have to peel those things apart.
Can I just add, one skill is kind of drop it and transcend it. What problem? You're saying shut out everybody to bypass for exertions. The other skill, is coming back. Really.
So I actually really like where we're going with this, because it kind of goes into this idea of when is a cult a good thing? And to me, I was talking to Terry earlier, and it was, this thing came up, and it was this moment when you know you're being hijacked and you're okay with it. And I think the difference between when you're in a cult is you really don't think you're being hijacked. You think you're just joining a group of people that care about you. You're finding a new community. You're finding belonging. But there's moments when I'm hanging out with Terry and Will, and I just feel like we're having these amazing conversations with these incredible intellectuals who are blowing my mind. And I'm like, yes, take me. I'm into it, you know? And I think that's something that's very different. And I think this school of non-symbolic consciousness, frankly, from the outside, it could look kind of cultish, but the cool thing about it, and the thing that I think is really interesting and that might be worth talking about, is a lot of cults are doing science now. So One Taste is doing clinical research. The School of Non-Symbolic Consciousness is doing clinical research. So people are starting to study these things as medicine, right? Psychedelics are becoming medicine. So again, where do they begin and where do we end? Where do we begin and they end, and where do they begin and we end? I find it to be a really interesting discussion, because there's so much gray area now in these different communities.
So you've been talking about belonging, and my mind has just been spinning about the evolution of humanity and what has made us survive, and that part of that is having community and coexisting and having collaborative experiences, and how the cults play off of this need for belonging. And I'm curious about the role of NLP, which I feel we've seen a lot with the presidential campaign, and then also the inherent kind of trend of cultures to want a leader, and how all of this kind of satisfies that, and how do we navigate when everything could essentially be interpreted as a cult? I mean, I raised my hand because I go to Burning Man, and it is Burning Man a cult? You know?
Yeah.
So I'm curious what your thoughts are, this great line that could be
Totally.
this or that.
I mean, I'm gonna maybe hand it over to someone else, because I don't really have a good answer.
Okay, well, no. That was for a different reason, but I might take my jacket off, who knows. Look, so the big cult, right? I mean, the biggest cult. How many of you guys were surprised by the election results? Shocked? Okay. That's a crazy cult, because that was not going to happen. She was inevitable. She was always going to win, right? And okay, so suddenly you realize that your sense-making apparatus was totally hijacked, and you're lost and you're at sea. Now, whatever you think about the current president of the United States, everything got worse and worse and worse and worse and worse until he won, right? For him, it was just getting bad. And his ability to track something else, to track the feedback mechanism that came from those rallies. There's a guy who everybody should check out called Timur Kuran, who's a Turkish economist who studies when revolutions happen. And the idea is that everybody has two sets of preferences, the preferences you show each other and the preferences that you keep at home. And if I tell you that only misogynist, troglodyte bigots support Donald Trump, and I then ask, and who will you be voting for, sir? Right? The idea is, of course, you're going to skew your data. And so it was very clear that if you follow preference falsification, that a lot of people are going to go into the booth and then they close the door behind them and say, I can't stand Hillary. What the hell is she talking? Gun control after the Pulse nightclub shooting? Are you kidding me? You're trying to vote for Hillary, vote Trump, right? You're surprising yourself. So in part, what happened is that there was this massive cult-like experience. Same thing with the 2008 crisis, right? You had this thing called the Great Moderation in economics, where volatility had been banished from the markets, and everything was getting quieter and quieter and quieter and quieter until, boom, the whole thing goes, right? And then, Alan Greenspan says, it's possible there was an error in my theory. So fundamentally, this question, like, why did I wear a jacket? Because I figured nobody else would, so I can do the baritone voice thing, right? So there are these ways in which we don't realize that we're being indoctrinated all of the time. And the key question is, when you start to break out of this, do you immediately lurch for other meaning? People always say to me, Eric, if you don't believe the New York Times, you must be a Fox News person. I'm like, no, there is no place to get your information. I don't have any idea what just happened in Syria. I mean, it seems very strange that suddenly Fareed Zakaria looks into the camera and says, the moment he struck Syria was the moment he became president of the United States, right? And then the New York Times writes, he went back on all of his previous thinking when he saw the children. How do they know this? From where does this come? So before this, my belief is that Donald Trump appealed to a buried meme inside of the Christian community of the United States called Daddy's Home. Okay, things are out of control. We're weak. We're getting pounded, but Daddy's going to come home, and then things will be okay. And that was this sort of pre-existing Christian architecture that Donald Trump understood, and everyone else did not, right? There was a different architecture, which is your crazy Jewish uncle who may not understand economics, but boy, is his heart good, and since the 1950s, he's stuck it out for the left, right? That was a different meme, right? And then there was the Pantsuit Nation meme, which it's our time, okay? Well, all of these are these different crazy mimetic complexes, none of which made any effing sense, right? It was this battle of crazy baby boomer memes, and none of them made any sense to an X or a millennial worth their salt, because fundamentally, like, we were breaking into swimming pools during the drought in California, and I never saw parents. I don't remember seeing parents while I was growing up. It was a totally different ethos. And so you've got this very strange, large demographic bulge that went through some formative experience. I'm trying to get away with this as like almost the oldest guy in the room, but there are a couple people in front of me, yeah. I think that the idea is that Trump was the wrecking ball, or more precisely, we were being tied in Gordian knots, and we couldn't untie them as fast as the media could tie them, until Trump decided to slash them. And in some sense, that was his great initial function. And then somehow nobody thought enough about how do you scale up an entire government after this tiny cadre of people makes use of the fact that the cognitive architecture is falling apart, because you don't have 10,000 son-in-laws, right? So that's like this really significant problem if you're a family business kind of a guy. But here we are, and there's nothing, I don't know where the rest of you are turning for sense making. I'm cobbling it together from a tiny network of people who managed to get through this election and didn't tell me significant lies. And it's fewer than 20 people. I have this idea of an A-frame roof, and the rationality people are dancing on the apex of the A-frame roof, and if you fall off this way, you become a deplorable, like a real deplorable, and if you fall off this way, you become politically correct, right? And there are about 20 people who can dance on the A-frame roof in public who have not fundamentally fallen one way or the other, and it's down to that. It's like, I don't like the early Star Wars pictures, but there's one thing that's really important, which is execute Order 66, kill all the Jedi. So we're down to about like 25 Jedi, and that's what we have, in my opinion, because nothing is making sense, and none of those people understand what just happened in Syria. Something huge just happened to flip the narrative. I have no access to it. I don't want to tell you it's a conspiracy. I just don't know what happened. And if somebody tells you that they do know what happened, my guess is that that's probably somebody you want to downregulate.
Yeah, I did. I mean, it's incredible. And I mean, I do think we go back a long way. I'm suspicious of the skies falling now, and I know you're not really saying that. We may have been able to kind of scale our ability to use narratives in these ways, or it's just we've lost control of the vehicle in that way. I suppose for myself, I'm at this point, based on my own experience, I'm just interested in kind of I know I can't really use null hypothesis in this way because I've been debunked on this by Daniel, but there's a certain sense of like how far are you prepared to, what are you building on? Where are your ideas being built upon? And I feel there has to be a willingness to go pretty far down. And unfortunately, I think cults often offer like deep dives, but unfortunately they deep dives in this kind of orthogonal way, so they miss some really obvious, just bad thinking. But I think you have to be prepared to go down and strip the essence of self really really down to a kind of core place. And I suppose the reason I'm saying that is when I hear a degree of kind of a rally in what you're saying, and maybe I'm wrong, Eric, but
Come with me, Will. Everything's going to be just fine.
right. But for me it's the narrative. It's like we're so susceptible. I know one of the things I bumped into is like people are always worried about drugs in your case, or all of these kind of bad vices that people are susceptible to. The thing we're really called susceptible is narrative. Like unless you can see how narrative is coming into your system.
There's all sorts of weird things happening.
But I feel like whatever. No, because I feel this kind of like I feel kind of swelled by your message, and it has so much, but it's there's this righteous thing that again, how do we orient around kind of like true and false versus right and wrong, which I think is a really important part of the puzzle.
Yeah, so I want to try to speak to this real quick. I think there's two ways to make a mistake here. Well, it was probably more than two, but two I want to point out, which is, one is to soak up narratives wholesale, to treat a narrative as if it's real, to not be able to get underneath what are the assumptions in this thing, right? And the other way is to be the super skeptic who just looks at every narrative and says, narrative, right? And then so just doesn't let any narrative enough room to try to explain anything, right? And so one of the interesting skills, if you want to ask the question, what are the, forget about how many Jedi there are right now, but of the people who are Jedi, what are the skills that they're possessing? And I've begun to try to catalog this, and one of the main ones that I see really lacking right now, if we use the political sphere as something to point at, I've seen people in disagreements, active disagreements about things, where neither party is actually in any way sure about what they're disagreeing about, and neither party actually feels that they need to hold their feet to the fire to figure that out as the point of the conversation, right? And so, as a specific example, in some of the questions about whether Trump, not Trump, one of the main disagreements that I think I'm seeing is the question, it's very analogous to the environmental movement in the 90s, where there's the question of, when companies start to develop greenwashing campaigns, right, in the 90s, there was two mixed reactions to this in the environmental movement. One was, great, even though they're sort of pretending, let's let them pretend and let's keep calling out the worst pretenders, and eventually the ethic will get to where we need it to be, right? And then another group said, screw that. Everyone is just pretending, and in the pretending, they're getting away with murder, and so let's rip away their ability to do pretense. Right, so you're seeing this right now. There's a question of, does the degradation of what a politician should be Like, you've got one group of people that's saying Trump just lays bare how everyone has been faking it in politics, and the whole thing is a Potemkin village. Nobody knows what the hell is going on. Everyone's pretending like they're a good politician. And you've got another camp saying, no. If you let that erode, if you let that vision of what we should be erode, then the ethics pull away from the system, and you're left with just banana republic behavior, right? And so the question is not, do we solve this? The question is, can we get to a point in conversation where we can understand where we're structurally disagreeing? Can you let the two narratives, both narratives are interesting, right? Both narratives are potentially real and legitimate and understandable. But if you don't have the ability to let the two narratives speak and to hear them both as plausible explanations, then you're just caught in these conversations.
I mean, the thing that really scares me about this is that I don't think it's the right dichotomy, and we've talked about this a lot. We have the front of a Potemkin village, and if we don't decide that we're going to get super busy and, call to action and bad news bears, and we're going to have to work real hard before we win. The key question is, when you find out it's a Potemkin village, does that energize you to want to build it out into the actual village that it was always pretending to be, to de-Potemkinize? That's where we are. And it seems like a completely insane task. But yeah, it was a Potemkin village. Clearly, over and over and over and over and over again. How many times do you have to get hit in the head before you realize it's Potemkin village? But the question is, okay, then what? Is anybody motivated by the shared delusion of the United States of America that fundamentally we all thought sort of rocked and we sort of knew was fake? Does anybody want to build it, or are we just all going to sit around waiting for somebody? Because that's what we do. I know a decent chunk of the world's more powerful people, and mostly they're waiting. Where is this going to happen? They're looking for this thing, and it's never going to occur to us that fundamentally we actually have had all this stuff knocked out, and it's time to get to work or not, and that's going to be our fate.
What's the famous Lenin phrase? The people have failed to rise. Post the revolution. I mean,
If that's your biggest fear, that fundamentally we're going to, we don't get fooled again. Okay, that's your biggest fear, but. Yes, it's true. We've never blown ourselves up before, but we've only had thermonuclear weapons for a very brief period of time. We haven't had gene drives for very long. For fuck's sake, we have had Wireshark for like 4 minutes. This is all absolutely terrifying. And to say, well, people have always thought that when we had the seed drill. No, obviously not. This is totally different. This is a different situation. And the very funny part about it is that we're using goddamn heuristics rather than first principles thinking. And with all due respect, I totally understand the fear that somebody's going to call us to action, somebody's going to tell us we need to coordinate, somebody's going to tell us we need to roll up our sleeves. But, we're all going to go back home. We're all going to try to figure out what the hell is just happening. None of you are going to have a clue. I know I don't. And, we're going to continue to wait. And I think that that's the most fascinating thing, which is that the fear of cult keeps us from actually organizing. And the thing that's so interesting to me about the human potential movement is that all of you freaks and weirdos only occur here because reality is the second best strategy. It's what you discover when social reality fails you. But the fact of the matter is most of us can't even form hierarchies the way any Republican country club could to hold a charity event, because we're all busy saying, no, I have to be me, I'm an individual, I'm not taking orders from anyone, right? We have a bunch of people focused on leadership, nobody's interested in followership. For fuck's sake, I'm a follower. If you have a good idea, I'll follow you. I'm decently smart and I've got some energy. But we don't do this stuff because we've never seen the good model. And that's really the important thing, is that, okay, you live in a Potemkin village, and if that's your biggest realization, and it stops there, then fundamentally that's where it stops. And if your fear is the greatest thing is you'll be called to action, or the strong man will rise up, or you'll see cult-like behavior, then what you're talking about is you can't even hold a bake sale.
I think
we will definitely have time. Just one. You'll definitely be next.
I just have a quick response.
Oh, and
Yeah. But there's something I've been seeing lately, and I'm not quite sure how to get at this, but it's in relationship to what you're saying, Eric. It's we're paying attention to the wrong things in a very interesting way. I was recently in an environment where somebody was, anyway, I'm not going to go into that story. The more important point is, it's like if you just drop into like a certain quality of consciousness, for lack of a better word, you guys can see the games we're all playing on this panel. Like, we're human. You guys run these operating systems in different ways, but it's obvious we're doing the cult mind experience right now, you know, and yet I totally appreciate Eric's point about we can't flatline this. Like, we have to find a way to construct something out of that fact. But I feel like we get lost in a lot of the details of the kind of what I feel like are irreverent facts about ourselves or each other or culture or whatever. We're spending 98% of our consciousness, as far as I can tell, on stuff that is irrelevant at this point. And I think this is what Trump, you know, the Trump phenomenon kind of revealed, is like, holy shit, you know, the facts are not the facts. In the way that we thought, I don't want to go down the Trump lane too far, because but I really do feel like, you know, if I'm sitting here, I mean, part of me can only be up here because I've started to see through my own self. I'm like, oh, wow. Yeah, I'm self-conscious. I'm power hungry. I'm a manipulative bitch from hell. Of course, you know, I mean, that just is the case. And, you know, and men have their own versions of that. Women have their own versions of that, whether it's sexuality or intellect or... we're all playing these games, and yet I know we already see through them. But we just don't pay attention to the fact that we've already seen through them, and then we're not able to have those conversations about reality, as far as I can tell. So I'm kind of going super, I think, first principle. I could be wrong about that.
You called the election as well.
And so, to me, it's just like, it's so raw being us as humans. I mean, it's a mess, as far as I can tell. And yet, it's also beautiful and fascinating and mostly useless at this moment. But I feel like we have an opportunity, because the cult mind has been exposed, I think, in a pretty, you know, at a level that I think maybe has happened a few times. I could be wrong about that. I'm done.
That's great.
I want to hold up Terry for a second, though, because one of the...
Can I get some water?
Well, yeah, I don't need to physically hold you up. I'm just going to conversate. I think the only thing I want to push on and disagree with in her statement is that we all see it. I think to the point of visiting these cults, you know, Terry and Will have had what I consider to be the world's most non-standard instruction in psychology, because they put themselves into a situation that has radically different architecture than the way that standard Western society works. And I think they generally do, they got a lot from that experience and were deeply able to see aspects of reality, specifically the one you were just talking about, aspects of the way in which, you know, depersonalized psychology operates in such a way, like, you know, if I had never left the United States, I'd be very hard pressed to talk about the cultural differences between the United States and other places. And you guys left, and you left hard, like consensus reality, for quite a while. And so I would just say you got a lot from that experience. You learned a lot, and we shouldn't be shy of visiting these drastically different architectures, whether they be, you know, something that's sort of normalized now, like Burning Man, or something sort of more far out there. Just pick ones that aren't antagonistic towards you. Pick ones that you can actually think you can learn from, and visit them like you'd visit another country.
Beautiful.
I really, really want to open up this to questions. So before we do that, I'm going to, as I mentioned, give you something to take home, because I think it's really important that we have some strategies for avoiding mind control. And one of the best things that I read was, a strong self-worth can stop mind control. And this is Robert Cialdini's website, which everyone should look up. And it's learn to keep your sense of self-worth even in intimidating circumstances. As far as possible, do not accept the initial premise that someone is better or more competent than you. Don't accept generalizations or inadequate explanations to your questions or challenges. Complex communication does not make conclusions acceptable. Be careful too of false analogies, semantic distortion, euphemisms, and jargon. Be wary of, you won't understand it now, but you will in the future. A real expert can explain his field so that even a 10-year-old understands. Always look for information and criticisms before joining a group and investing your time and money. Train yourself and your children to notice the influence tricks in language used in, for example, advertisements. And if you haven't heard about these 6 tips, 6 mechanisms of influence, it's 6 principles. Reciprocation, so if I give you something, you give me something. Consistency, social proof, liking, authority, and scarcity. There's a great book on influence you should read. Avoid negative dialogue about yourself, especially if it's generated by someone else. And think of being different as being important rather than inferior. So we'll open it up for questions.
But be prepared to try all of those things on, I would say.
Oh yeah.
Because otherwise...
Now you in the back have been having your arm up for a little while.
Yeah, I have a question about, for example, a friend of mine once referred to the yoga medicine as a cult.
Iboga as a cult.
Yeah, this is so common maybe about medicine specifically, but also the ways in which cults, the way I've heard the term sometimes, I spend a lot of time listening as much as I can to indigenous culture, especially when it comes to psychedelics and healthy culture, which is ecology, and looking for alternate paradigms to like the centering of like Western European mindset. But sometimes cult is used to refer to a body of wisdom and practices that have been cultivated to do specific things. For example, healing or connecting with ancestors. So I'm curious if any of you have heard that take on the phrase cult, and like involving, if you have any thoughts on Western medicine and other paradigms or histories of approaching the body.
Sure. I mean, okay, so that's a lot, but I mean, we weren't going to go into entomology tonight. However, I did do a little bit of research on the word cult and where it came from. And so in Latin, it came from cultus, care, labor, cultivation, culture, but also worship and reverence. So it does really date back a long, long time ago to this idea of worship and this idea of reverence. And I, as a physician and a Western physician, I felt like, well, in a lot of ways, I felt like it was a cult that I had to leave, in a way. I felt very strongly that my experience in mainstream healthcare was like a priesthood, where they taught me a new language that only we knew how to use, and so we separated ourselves from the patients in that way. We also had to wear white coats, which separated us. We all wore the same things. They also took a lot of money from me, and they also deprived me of a lot of sleep, which is a great way to control people's minds. And then there's a pretty consistent amount of depersonalization. Like you really, really break down after hours and hours in the hospital. So to me, there was a moment where I just felt like, oh my God, I am not liking the person I am becoming. I don't like this version of me. And I was in pediatrics of all things. So I left that world and decided to sort of carve my own version of reality by questioning it, by questioning everything I knew.
Can I just say one thing?
Sure.
I just came up with a definition of cult as a casual, useless, loose truth.
I love it. I love it. Except for when you're in it, it seems so permanent. And
No, of course.
You know,
of
it
course.
seems so concrete. It seems so, like you're really taught in medicine to just trust and believe that everything we know is right, and that everything we know is based on science. But then you actually get into the practice of medicine, and so much of it is culture. So much of it is what your attending taught you. So much of it is actually not based on the guidelines, and you bring the guidelines to them. Like, for example, I was in the emergency room and they made me give people rectal exams who were experiencing like back trauma. And I looked it up and I go, this just can't be right. Like this just can't be it. Because I'd made a few young men cry. And I was like, this just seems fucked up that they're making me do this. So I bring all the evidence to my attending to prove to him that this isn't scientifically sound. And he's like, this is just how we do it here. I was like, okay. So, Yeah, I mean that's the scary thing about medicine, and that's a scary, and also like there's a lot to be said about what psychedelics as medicine, because I also feel like there is a giant movement of psychedelics that's resurging, and a lot of it's being medicalized, which may or may not be a good thing. But then there's also just tons of people doing ayahuasca, and there are plenty of people that are benefiting from it dramatically, but there's plenty of people who are being permanently altered in negative ways. And I don't think that's talked about enough. And I think that it's, like I tell people, choose your ayahuasquero like you would choose your neurosurgeon. And like choose them wisely and really do your research and talk to people who've gone to them and make sure that they know what they're doing, because it's mind changing. It is definitely going to change your life. I don't know if that answers your question. I'm really trying.
I want to see if I can speak to that question just a little bit, like on that, bootstrapping on that last point. It's sort of a strange thing to me that in San Francisco, unlike sort of the rest of the country, I feel like I'm in the opposite cult here, where there's a cult of fetishizing Aboriginals. And this is true, and I'm not trying to pick on you in particular, but this is endemic lately in 2017 in the Bay Area. And what we have to be open to the idea that there are things that other cultures understood that we don't, or we've lost, or we don't have access to. Absolutely. But in the words of David White, a poet, become impatient with easy explanations. And there are these easy explanations that are being offered right now. And one of the offerings is just take ayahuasca and it'll open your mind, right? Another easy explanation is the natives have access to truth that we couldn't possibly comprehend. Right? This is almost exactly like the guru saying, I have access to truth you can't possibly comprehend. It's the same structure. It's just projected out, fetishized onto a group of people. And so I really, we're just discovering the nature of these compounds and their effects on the mind. And we're just beginning to open a dialogue that actually has nuance in it, that actually has self-questioning and self-criticality. What do these things do? What are the side effects of it? And this is things that the medical establishment is quite good at as soon as it gets to them, but oftentimes doesn't get to them for an extended period of time, right? And so I think we just need to really watch out for our desire to wrap simple explanations like, oh, they have the answer. Like the answer's in the Amazon. And I don't think that's true.
Just to take one last riff on it, I think that certain of these compounds have sort of highly conserved reported experiences that may differ from person to person. But first, the Sonoran Desert Toad 5-MeO-DMT experience, if you listen to people who've gone through it, very often you can't imagine the two people who have never met each other are reporting things in the same way. Or the Iboga experience, which you bring up, people going back to some particular incident with absolute clarity that they didn't know that they'd stored, or the ayahuasca experience where somebody says, yeah, I was hoping to work on this, and the plant said, no, we're going over here and working on this thing that you didn't even know. The plant knew what I needed. All of this sort of Marin County speak for things that we can't get to because we don't understand the brain, we don't understand its perturbations, and we're nowhere close with medicine. So I think what you see is that somebody's handed you, just like your phone is a digital Swiss Army knife, the Schedule 1 Swiss Army knife that comes with all of these very strange people attached to it. It never made sense to me because nobody ever told you that you had a shaman for your first sip of Jägermeister, or something like this. These compounds are so powerful, and the prosthesis that goes along with it is fundamental in some way, so that if you're working on relationship trauma, with MDMA, and there's a question about what your integrative experience is going to be like, and you have this underground therapy movement, you have to think about this sort of weird fact that the pharmaceutical Swiss Army knife of plant and related medicine comes with this very strange collection of humans and practices as powerful prostheses. And we're just not very far out, and you're taking your life in your own hands, and there's certainly seemingly incredible gains to be made, incredible pitfalls, and we've, like asses, done this under the Controlled Substances Act, which I think was basically supposed to knock out Negroes and Jews as the troublesome populations with and Mexicans, yeah, troubling Mexicans. So, I think what's really time is fundamentally to do the science at an incredible pace, because we need some version of this stuff, and we need to borrow from some of this wisdom that has grown up with it, and we need to get rid of some of the nonsense that goes along with it, because you're so susceptible when you've just been shown that your mind has a panic room in it, and you've been living in your mind for 10 years, and suddenly you realize that if you pull out the World Almanac, that the bookcase slides open, and there's an entire ice cave in the center of your house. You probably have an idea that it would be helpful if somebody who was the architect could tell you what just happened. And we don't have a good answer for this, and we're just in a terrible place, and hopefully Johns Hopkins and NYU and a bunch of powerful folks in the Bay Area are going to speed this thing up.
Totally. All right, more questions.
Yeah, in the vein of the salon, I'd like to maybe just take some of what you've all said and reflect it back. Essentially, the sense of existentialism, in a way. A lot of this seems to be discussing, taking the assumption that the world is a chaotic place, it's difficult to live in this world. If any one of us were taken to the middle of the forest without our culture, without our mythologies, without our supporting structures, the underlying chaotic nature would become very apparent very quickly, and you feel very alone and very frightened and very weak in the face of that experience.
Yeah.
And that's the human condition from that existentialist position. And so much of what we build up around us over time, this is our nature as social beings, are these mechanisms of dealing with that existential reality. And it's not obvious to me that some of the clear, bright lines that have been discussed tonight are as clear as we're saying that they are. And simultaneously, we're saying things like there is unique language used within cults, and we are also using unique language ourselves, such as things like gaslighting, that are very unique terms and also carry moral weight and ethical imperative of their own when being used. And along those lines, we talk about these types of things we're creating with blurry lines, and it's a matter of scale across time and across size. And I think that's important in terms of when you're trying to analyze it and talk about it. Because it's like, if it was created today and two people believe in it, it's very easy to say that's silly. If it was created 2,000 years ago and it circumscribes most of our culture, it's much more difficult to say that's silly, because we're so entrenched within it that we cannot even see it. And because of this, it seems to me that when we talk about the idea of cults at this level, the highest level, the etymological level, cult and culture, at this largest layer of both time and scale, what we're talking about is how does the individual act when faced with all of these trials and tribulations, and many people are talking about, and we've talked about so many differentiated ways that this is manifesting, and yet for some reason we're almost partaking in the medical, focusing on the word cult through which we look at all of these problems. So I'm just curious,
Totally.
What is the word cult to each of you, and why is that a good way to look at these problems?
If I had like this really beautiful, easy answer for you, I would totally have it out. But that's the thing about all this is, to me, it all got started when I gave up religion when I was in my 12th grade of high school, and I just remember I was having a conversation with a friend of mine over America Online, and he was this really smart guy who was studying sociology at Harvard. And he just kept on asking me all these questions about my belief system. And then I just remember it crumbling, totally falling apart. And I had nothing left. And I went to the bathroom and I stared in the mirror and I looked at myself and I cried. Because I felt so alone. I felt so confused. And I felt like I didn't have any answers. And after that, I kind of decided, okay, I hadn't learned anything in high school, so college I should probably learn some things. And I get to U of I, and I realize my classes aren't teaching me what I want, so I start working in the history and philosophy library. And I remember reading books upon books upon books, and just feeling like the more I read, the less I knew. The more I read, the less I understood. And the more I read, the more I was like really drawn to the drug section, because I was like, this seems cool. I was like, this seems real cool. And I was terrified of taking any psychedelics. I was like, this is going to ruin my life, but also, this is amazing. And I had this dream of like moving to the Bay Area, and someday I'll make it out there. And part of it was because it seemed like there was this freedom of thought here that was so special and so different than living in Illinois. And so the word cult really to me is just this idea of mind control by a group to somehow enable, somehow it serves us in a way, you know? There was this note that I had here about how, you know, cults and memes and all these mental hijacking, they're doing something for us, and they're taking something from us. And I guess the question that we have to keep asking ourselves is, what are we willing to give to these groups for, and what are we receiving from them? You know, like, I want belonging, and I want community, and I want to feel smart, but I also realize that being comfortable with being alone is really a core value of mine. Like, I think it's important that we all learn to be alone, and we learn to be by ourselves. But yet, at the same time, I think it's really important that we find people around us that can provide us with this. Like, I really do believe that Maslow had something to his hierarchy, and that having community does bring me a certain level of comfort and security in a world that seems really scary. So the word cult to me is something that it has a negative connotation in some ways, like it, and yet at the same time it has a positive connotation. Like, I love cult movies. I love things that have, I love Pulp Fiction. I love, you know, Donnie Darko. I love things that give me a sense of like, I don't know, like, I know something other people don't. So that's about all I got.
So there's a philosopher, Manfred Max Neef, and sort of Chilean economist philosopher, and he has this quote that I always butcher and I can't quite get right, but it's something like, every generation is responsible for creating a language that is matched to the kind of problems it's trying to solve. And to a certain extent, I want to talk about the fact that I think the word cult has outlived its usefulness. So I talk a lot about this in terms of wasting disease. So if we talk about disease in the late 19th century, there was this thing. A doctor would come over to your house and say, "I'm sorry, your wife seems to be dying." Oh, doctor, what is she dying from? Oh, wasting disease, right? So the question is, what happened to wasting disease? Did we cure it? No, we just simply discovered that, well, okay, that's like cancer and lupus, and there's like 20 different things that we used to call the same thing because we didn't have a good enough language to discuss the differences. So I think it's about time that we do the same thing with the word cult. It's outlived its utility. We need to talk about all the different components of it. We need to talk about discourse systems. We need to talk about closed communities. We need to talk about shared truth. We need to talk about all the components of it. We need to talk about the weaponized ones that are designed to confuse and are like mazes for consciousness. We need to talk about the ones that just pop up because a bunch of people were onto something early. And so, sort of to unask the question a little bit, I'm less interested in defining cult than I am about finding the new words that would unpack, that the word cult would unpack to, if only we were so smart as to never have used that word in the first place.
So that riff was so good that I forego any insight I might have had.
You what?
That was too good.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
Mic drop.
Are we at a point where maybe we should be breaking
Yeah,
out of this?
all
And
right,
stuff?
guys, I just have to say, like, this, I throw events together kind of on my free time, and I never know how they're gonna turn out. And this, to me, totally exceeded my expectations, partially because I had a few people who were supposed to be part of this evening, Tristan Harris, who couldn't make it because he's busy changing the world in New York. And I'm just letting you all know that I feel a deep sense of gratitude for all of you showing up tonight and being part of this, and a deep sense of gratitude for Eric and for everyone on stage, because these people are some of the smartest people that I know, and I kind of knew that if I just put them all together and we all started talking, that something magic would happen. And I think everyone agrees that this has been pretty good. So thank you.
Molly, thank you. You made all this happen, so thank you very much. And thank you all. Hope it was interesting.
And there may be some stenciling outside. I don't know if it's set up, but it might be happening. So check it out on your way out and make some cool art propaganda.